Welcome back and thanks for joining us in our third session. In this session, Rosalie, Chepo and I will continue to unpack the components of the land administration system. In this session of 3 videos, we will look at land governance, land information, and land tenure and rights.
These elements do not fit into the hierarchy of land policy, land management, and land administration, as illustrated in the pyramid figure and as discussed in the previous session. Rather, these elements transcend and are embedded in each level of the land administration system.
So we begin by discussing the concept of governance as distinct from government before focusing our attention on land governance. This term is sometimes used synonymously with land administration or land management. But as you should have realized by now, we are stressing the distinctions in meanings between terms. Land administration, land management, and land governance are all distinct yet interrelated components of the land administration system.
Thanks for clarifying all that, Rosalie. It's so easy to mix up the terms. So in this video, we're going to try and make sure that you walk away understanding what land governance is and how it fits into the broader land administration system. And we're also going to introduce something called democratic land governance. So by the end of that, we'll end off looking at the consequences of failed land governance.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Rosalie Kingwa. I'm a research associate at PLAS at the University of the Western Cape. So before moving on to land governance, let's start by getting our heads around the concept of governance. This will help us understand land governance when we get to that a little bit later on. Governance comes from the word governing, not government. It applies to any governing institution, such as a family trust, a public facility, a corporation, and the government. The idea of governance is fairly recent in the literature, and it's partly a rebellion against the idea that only the government does governance. Many types of institutions require different types of governance. Governance is a neutral concept. It does not say whether it's good or bad, weak or strong, because it doesn't pronounce on the quality of the governance. There are many different qualities or types of governance. Whether they are autocratic or democratic, they are still governance. The effectiveness of governance, of course, depends on whether it meets policy objectives, and these differ from country to country. So what we consider good governance depends on our society's norms and expectations. So the first point we need to understand is that governance is neutral. It has no qualities inherent in the word, good or bad, transparent or hidden. That's the first point. The second point we've made is that it's broader than the government. In many countries, state actors coexist with their customary, religious, or informal counterparts. The stakeholders in land reflect a broad spectrum of state actors, non-state actors, community or customary authorities, and the private and professional sectors. And the third point that we are making at this stage is it begs the question of the capacity to govern, whoever their constituency may be. So these are the 3 points we've made so far. Governance in itself is neutral. It involves state or non-state actors, and it raises the important question of the capacity to govern. So what does governance refer to, and how is governance practiced? Well, governance comprises the processes, institutions, and actions of governing. It includes rules and structures that govern and mediate relationships, decision-making, and enforcement. The rules may be formal, informal, or customary. Processes mean that governance is dynamic. It's about how issues are put on the agenda, how decisions are made and by whom, how those decisions are implemented, and how differences and grievances are managed. And processes implies interaction and relationships and partnerships. And these involve dialogue, cooperation, conflict, unilateralism or bilateralism, negotiation, compromise, exit, partnerships, and so on. And these are in flux, they change over time. Some NGOs that focus on human rights or land rights, as well as worker and farmer organizations, have begun developing national engagement strategies with their governments through multi-party stakeholder platforms, which we call MSPs, which is another example of governance. So governance is essentially about how society, or the groups within it, organize to make decisions and carry them out. You could say it's concerned with the way society is managed. In our complex world with competition for limited resources, this requires authority. Governing and governance therefore implies having authority to conduct the policy, actions, and affairs of a state or an organization, or any facility for that matter. Governance includes the way goals are set, policies implemented, and actions undertaken to realize those goals. So in the light of the elements of governance we've just described, it should be clear that these concerns will mean mediating competing interests and priorities. Within any jurisdiction, whether it's a community or a country, there are multiple development objectives and multiple stakeholders who have interests that range from basic survival to personal enrichment to societal well-being. Governance is therefore always about how interests of different groups are reconciled. It also means that governance is all about authority, and thus it is about politics and power. In particular, whose power prevails and over what agenda, especially a reform agenda. So we've seen that governance occurs at many levels of society, from government to businesses, trade unions, religious groups, to academic institutions. And they apply to collective ownership bodies. Yes, even schools have governing bodies whose role is the oversight of school governance, and under their elected committees to govern collective ownership, like communal property associations, known as CPAs in South Africa, or body corporates for sectional title, also a South African form of tenure. So, and we've stressed that governance does not only refer to formalized processes, but includes both formal and informal processes. So to complicate the issue, in countries like South Africa, we have legal pluralism, which we've discussed in several earlier videos. This is where we have multiple legal systems that sometimes embody competing or conflicting or different norms. The idea of governance is very handy because it helps to bridge these divides by providing a single concept for the processes, institutions, and activities of governing that we've just been describing. So in this sense, it helps to overcome the connotations of a hierarchy of law or legal systems, and of the perception by some that customary law, in its living or legitimate sense, is somehow inferior to the common law. This, of course, does not mean we can turn a blind eye to the structural inequalities in societies like ours, where these distinctions often mirror the discrimination and injustice that prevails. But it does help us become more conscious of our biases. Now, when it comes to governance by the government, we like Francis Fukuyama's definition that governance is a government's ability to make and enforce rules and deliver services. Stress is on ability, and ability is about capacity, as we mentioned earlier. So when we look at land governance later on, the issue of state capacity is very important, bearing in mind poverty and inequality. In South Africa, civil society organizations often play a role in governance, and they sometimes perform the work of the state. You could even say that NGOs compensate for the weaknesses in state capacity. In informal settlements, for example, official governance by the municipality or national government may be negligible compared to the role played by local community organizations or NGOs. In that example, clearly the government should be governing by providing resources to those who most need it, even if formal partnerships are eventually made. The private sector also undertakes many aspects of land governance in South Africa, but this is in terms of law and statute. The problem there is that civil society and professionals tend to have very limited influence over policy making, though in many countries they are constantly calling for more participation and more consultation. So to start summing up about governance, however we look at it, there are three dimensions: authority, decision-making, and accountability. So firstly, let's look at whose voice prevails in making decisions. Are decisions made from the top down, such as by governments or bosses deciding for those under their authority or employment? Or from the bottom up, by citizens or employees? Or is it by a combination of both? How are decisions made in conflicts or disputes mediated? This question implies a process of decision-making and dispute resolution. We've been stressing process throughout these definitions. Are all stakeholders consulted and given opportunity to have their say? Are only some elites consulted in the name of consultation? Or do those with authority make the decisions without consultation? How are conflicting demands, applications, or claims mediated? And who is accountable? Who is responsible for the outcomes, and how is the quality of outcome measured, such as expenditure? What standards are in place for measuring accountability? When outcomes are considered a failure, who gets hauled over the coals? So finally, in summing up, we are going to refer to a concise definition of governance that we've taken from the FAO, which neatly draws together all the threads we've discussed in this video. And I'm going to quote: governance is the exercise of political, economic, and administrative authority in the management of a country's affairs at all levels. Governance is a neutral concept comprising the complex mechanisms, processes, and institutions through which citizens and groups articulate their interests, exercise their legal rights and obligations, and mediate their differences. Governance is also about the process of decision-making, as well as the implementation of the decisions taken. It must therefore focus on both the formal and informal actors and structures involved in decision-making, and how to implement the decisions made.
Land governance. Now that Rosalie has explained governance to us, let's take a closer look at how governance is applied to land. Keep those three dimensions in mind: authority, decision-making, and accountability, as we explore the role of governance in land administration.
Back in video 3, we highlighted the importance of land administration in the context of competition for diminishing land resources. having to manage competing priorities and interests over limited resources is particularly important in the context of strong competition over land, bearing in mind that land is a finite resource.
In keeping with the meaning of governance, land governance now refers to all the processes and actions associated with the land institutions. This ranges from land policies to land management, enforcement, and implementation. However, land governance encompasses the statutory, customary, and religious institutions, as well as the informal institutions.
Government institutions include state structures such as the ministries, government departments, and municipalities responsible for land. In South Africa, there are many land governing institutions that are in the private sector but regulated by the government, as well as community and customary institutions. Each institution has its own governance codes and processes, but collectively these constitute land governance. Land governance includes the legal and policy framework for land, informal or formal land allocation and development processes, as well as customary or traditional practices governing land transactions, inheritance, and dispute resolution.
So in short, Simon, what you're saying is that it includes all the relevant institutions from the state, civil society, and the private sector.
Correct. Although we include all actors in land governance, we are mostly concerned about strengthening official or government land governance. It is only the state that has the resources to deal with the scale of land administration in South Africa, and hence the argument would be to develop a more capacious state to undertake land administration.
So to help you understand land governance, I think you can think about the municipality responsible for governance in the area where you live. You can almost do like a quick mental audit of the state of governance by considering how it raises and collects revenue, for example, how it prioritizes problems that need to be fixed, how it delivers services, implements its plans, and spends its revenue. Who do they contract to do all the construction? How it makes and enforces building and zoning restrictions, and how it maintains or builds the road networks, etc., etc. How well does it enforce the policies and allocated budgets? As land resources are finite within a jurisdiction, there's often competition between the different stakeholders over the access to and the use of resources.
So an example might be how a municipality decides to allocate land between, say, parks on the one hand and areas for the poor to reside in and provide them with water and electricity, or to decide between the sometimes competing needs of street traders and formal store owners, or between the competing and conflicting demand for land to be set aside for an airport or golf course versus a subsidized housing development.
Yep. And many times the poor cannot access land via or even housing via the market, and therefore will depend on a very large degree to the city planning and state welfare. So if land use planning does not include enough land for the poor, how are they actually accommodated?
How indeed. Land governance also concerns other day-to-day issues such as potholes in the roads. What are the processes to repair them? If the water mains burst or taps stop functioning in settlements, or if the power goes out, how quickly does the municipality respond to rectify the issue? All of these require an ability to govern, or what we call capacity, because they relate to the municipality's ability to provide services and make and enforce rules and restrictions.
Yep. Land governance also has to address like civil disputes. For example, if there's family members who might be arguing over who inherits family property. So at a much wider scale, it might even be farmers and peri-urban food gardeners who are competing to use the same land. And that very same land might even be sought by others for residential or commercial or industrial purposes. Indigenous communities and environmentalists sometimes even go, head to head with each other over conservation, for land, or both with the timber companies over the use of forested lands. So you'll find sometimes that even local communities are going to compete with the tourist resorts for the scarce water, the land, and the fish stocks. Investors in the large-scale agricultural products for export crops and biofuels will also be competing with small-scale farmers.
So you see, land governance is fundamentally about power and the political economy of land.
Yep. Who benefits from the current legal, institutional, and policy framework for land?
How does this framework interact with traditional authorities and informal systems?
What are the incentive structures and constraints on the diverse land stakeholders?
Who has what influence on the way that the decisions about land use are made?
Who benefits and how?
How are the decisions enforced?
What recourse exists for the many grievances?
There are so many questions that must be addressed for effective land administration, and these can only be adequately addressed with strong land governance.
Yes, strong institutional capacity is so necessary to manage the competing priorities and the interests over limited resources. We've got the fact that the land cannot expand. It's a finite resource, and the increased production often threatens the environment.
We've seen how there could be multiple demands for or claims to the same parcel of land. For example, on one land area, there may be communities living on land governed by customary law, communities with overlapping rights or competing claims to communal land, conservation authorities wanting to protect the wildlife and vegetation, tourism industries wanting to build lodges on the land, agricultural authorities wanting to use the land for farming, peri-urban informal settlements spilling over onto agricultural land, international mining companies wanting to access the mineral reserves, government interests in developing schools, roads, water facilities, and other utilities or infrastructure on the land, power utilities wanting to build power lines or install wind turbines on the land.
Simon, everything you're telling me says there's virtually an endless list of the different groups of people and organizations and the entities that have very different interests on the same piece of land, making us realize that good governance is essential for ensuring that the competing interests are mediated through negotiation, and consultation in a way that promotes the different priorities.
The Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, sums this up with the distinction that governance is concerned with the processes by which citizens participate in decision-making, how government is accountable to its citizens, and how society obliges its members to observe its rules and laws. So the following working definition, also from the FAO, encapsulates the main elements of land governance that we are concerned with. They say land governance concerns the rules, processes, and structures through which decisions are made about access to land and its use, the manner in which the decisions are implemented and enforced, and the way that competing interests in land are managed.
Thanks for that, Simon. So just to summarize, land governance is fundamentally concerned with the government's ability to make and administer the rules, mechanisms, policies, processes, and institutions by which land, property, and natural resources are accessed, used, controlled, transferred, and managed. It therefore spans all the levels of land administration system, from policy through to management, down to land administration and the functions thereof.
It covers all the activities associated with land and natural resource management, preferably to achieve sustainable development.
And land administration systems operate within a context of land governance that dictates the potential success or failure of any land policy and strategy implementation.
We're now going to introduce you to something called democratic land governance that I found in a paper by Boris and Franco. They proposed this model of democratic land governance, which is a process involving the interaction between three components. You've got grassroots, pro-reform mobilizations from citizens and communities. That's a bottom-up approach. You've got the top-down state reform initiatives And in the middle, mutually reinforcing or democratically embedded interactions between these two. The focus here is on the question, how are decisions made? This perspective marks a shift away from the usual technical administrative notion of land governance and towards a human rights-based approach to development.
And in this conceptualization of land governance, one, grassroots mobilizations reflect the broad-based participation by citizens and communities in response to their own specific land-based needs. Two, the state's top-down initiatives that relate to their obligations as the duty bearers, for example, to provide services. And then three, you've got those mutually reinforcing, democratically embedded interactions between the two, reflecting accountability, transparency, and mutually beneficial collaboration.
So when there are competing interests, as we mentioned earlier, and all stakeholders are interested in using the same land, there should ideally be a system of democratic land governance to help mediate the claims in a transparent manner.
This requires negotiation and compromise because not all claims can be made. But through effective land governance, we hope that all the interests can be accommodated in the best way possible.
Without effective, accountable, and democratic land governance, what many call good governance, the powerful and wealthy can dominate negotiations when there is competition for land. The extreme example is the tragic case witnessed in South Africa of state capture. This is the ultimate outcome of failed governance, when certain people or groups of people influence policies for their own benefit.
And the FAO describes the consequences of state capture as follows. Those with power may illegally transfer state lands and common lands to themselves or their allies. They may implement land redistribution policies and laws in their favor and give unjust compensation to those whose land is acquired. They may make favorable decisions to change land use that cannot even be justified on objective grounds. Agreements can be made in secret by a small number of people, and by the time the public becomes aware of the decisions, it may be too late to intervene.
Sure, that hurts. By contrast, good land governance can contribute to improvements in social, economic, and environmental conditions. The FAO maintains that with good governance, benefits from land and natural resources are responsibly managed and the benefits are equitably distributed. Effective land management reduces social tensions and promotes economic growth and poverty reduction. When good governance exists, decision-making is more transparent and participatory. The rule of law is applied equally to all, and most disputes are resolved before they degenerate into conflict. Improved governance can result in land administration being simplified and made more accessible and effective.
That sounds brilliant. So I hope everyone who's watching will understand and appreciate that good land governance goes together with responsible and effective land administration. And it's one of the keys to its success and its sustainability.
Great, join us for the next video in this session where we will be discussing land rights and land tenure.